Welcome. Today we're exploring the Gupta Empire, a really significant period in the history of the Indian subcontinent. We're talking roughly mid-3rd to mid-6th century CE.
That's right. And at its height, its influence really stretched across a huge part of northern India.
Now, it's often called the Golden Age of India.
Yes, though that label itself, it does spark some debate among historians, but regardless of the title, the Gupta period, it absolutely saw this incredible flourishing of culture.
And huge progress in science governance.
Exactly. And some truly, truly impressive achievements in architecture, sculpture, painting, things like that.
So our aim today is pretty clear. We want to unpack the key aspects of this really influential empire, looking at the information we actually have.
Sounds good.
So maybe the first question is, where did the Guptas actually come from? It seems their beginnings are still a bit of a puzzle.
They really are. Their specific homeland, it's still discussed,
Yeah.
but there are two main theories people focus on. One suggests the lower Doab region, that's in modern Uttar Pradesh. And the evidence for this is mainly the concentration of early Gupta inscriptions, coin hoards found there.
Right, the physical evidence points that way.
And also, certain Puranas, those ancient Hindu texts, they mention places like Prayaga, Saketa, Magadha, all in the Ganges Basin as early Gupta areas.
Okay, so that's one strong possibility. What's the other main idea?
The other prominent theory puts their origins further east in the Bengal region. This comes mostly from the account of a 7th century Chinese Buddhist monk, Yi Jing.
Yi Jing, right.
He mentioned a king, Chalikito, who scholars generally think was the founder, Sri Gupta, and this king supposedly built a temple for Chinese pilgrims quite a way east of Nalanda, which would place it in Bengal.
Fascinating. So even the starting point is up for grabs, really.
Yeah.
Now, what about their social standing, their Varna? Do we know much about that?
Well, the Gupta records themselves, they don't actually spell it out. Some historians have suggested a Vaishya origin.
The merchant or agricultural class?
Correct. They draw links from some older texts that associate the name Gupta with that group. And the thinking goes, maybe they rose to power, resisting heavy taxes or something like that.
But I imagine there are arguments against that, too.
Oh, definitely. Critics will point out that the suffix Gupta shows up in names of people who weren't Vaishyas, both before and during the Gupta time.
So it wasn't exclusive.
Not at all. And it's also, quite possible Gupta just became the dynastic name taken from the first king. There are other theories, too, maybe Brahmin, maybe Dharana Gatra, but the evidence is pretty thin, honestly.
We have Gupta and Gatotkacha. What do we know about them?
Right. Gupta reigned roughly 240 to 280 CE. Then his son, Gatotkacha, from about 280 to 319 CE. Now, both of them use the title Maharaja.
Which means great king.
It does. But later on, that title was often used by rulers who were subordinate to a bigger power. So some people speculate maybe Gupta and Gatotkacha were initially vassals, perhaps to the Kushans.
Is that certain, though?
Oh, no, not at all. You do see paramount rulers using Maharaja sometimes. Still, the general feeling is their status was probably, let's say, less elevated than the next ruler, Chandragupta I.
And that identification of Yi Jing's Chalikito with Shripta, the temple builder.
That does give us a slightly more concrete early figure, and actually, quite recently, a silver coin, possibly belonging to Sri Gupta, turned up in Uttar Pradesh.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, it might point towards the Kashi-Kanauj area as an early power base, maybe even just Kashi, Varanasi initially. It just adds another layer to the whole origin discussion.
It certainly does. Okay, then comes Chandragupta I, around 319 to 335 CE. Things seem to get a bit more solid with him.
Absolutely. A really key event was his marriage to Kumaradevi, a princess from the Lichavi clan.
That sounds politically significant.
Immensely so, likely. It probably boosted his standing, his territory, enough for him to adopt that much grander title, Marjashiraja.
King of great kings.
Precisely. There's also a bit of scholarly back and forth about a figure named Kacha. Was he another name for Samudragupta? A rival. We're not entirely sure.
Right, and after Chandragupta I, we get Samudragupta, ruling around 335 to 375 CE. And this seems to be a time of major expansion.
Oh, without a doubt. His military campaigns are laid out in quite some detail on the Allahabad pillar inscription. Harisena, his courtier, composed it.
What does it say?
Well, it claims he uprooted 8 kings of Aravarta, that's the northern region, including the Nagas. He supposedly subjugated all the rulers of the forest regions, probably central India, and defeated 12 rulers down in Dakshinapatha, the south.
12 rulers in the south.
Yes, along the eastern coast, apparently going as far as the Pallava kingdom, defeating Vishnugopa of Kanchi.
That's a huge sweep of territory. What about the kingdoms on the edges, the frontiers? Were they directly ruled?
According to the inscription, rulers of several frontier kingdoms and tribal groups, places like Samatha, Davaka, Kamarupa, Nepal, and tribes like the Mallavas, Yodhiyas, Madrakas, they paid him tribute.
Ah, so more like acknowledging his dominance.
Exactly. They paid tribute, obeyed his orders, showed allegiance, so more like tributary states under his overarching authority rather than direct administration.
The inscription also mentions foreign kings seeking his favor, doesn't it? How literally should we take that?
Yes, it boasts about foreign kings attending his court, offering daughters in marriage, or perhaps maidens as gifts, and asking to use the Gupta seal with the Garuda emblem.
Sounds impressive.
It does, but historians tend to think this is probably, embellished. For example, the king of Simhala, Sri Lanka, is mentioned. But we know from Chinese sources that King Meghavarna just sent gifts and asked permission to build a Buddhist monastery.
So not exactly subservience.
Not really. It was more likely standard diplomatic exchange being framed quite skillfully as submission within the inscription itself.
That makes sense. Always got to consider the source and its purpose. What about Samudragupta himself? His beliefs, his character?
Well, inscriptions suggest he was a devout Vaishnavi, a follower of Vishnu. He performed Brahmanical ceremonies, including the famous Ashvamedha, the horse sacrifice, to really assert his imperial power.
A traditional marker of sovereignty.
Precisely. The records also mention him donating lots of cows and gold, but interestingly, the Allahabad pillar also paints him as wise, compassionate, even a talented musician and poet.
A poet king.
He was given the title King of Poets, actually, and his gold coins show him playing the veena, a stringed instrument. So it seems he had this artistic side, too.
A powerful warrior and an artist. That's quite a combination. So geographically, what was the extent of his direct control, roughly?
He directly ruled a large part of the Indo-Gangetic Plain and a good chunk of central India. And then surrounding that core area were these tributary kingdoms and tribal states in the north and southeast.
Okay. Now, there's a brief mention of someone named Ramagupta around 375 CE. What's his story?
Ah, Ramagupta. His existence is mainly known from a later play, the Divichandragupta, from the 6th century.
A play. How reliable is that?
Well, the play doesn't paint him in a great light. It shows him agreeing to surrender his queen to a Saka enemy, which then prompts his brother, Chandragupta, to step in heroically. Whether that specific story is true is debated.
But he did exist.
Yes, his existence is backed up by finding actual Jain statues dedicated during his time, and quite a few of his copper coins, especially in the Iran Vidisha area. They have early Gupta-style script and symbols like Garuda and lions.
So maybe a less glorious reign, but definitely part of the picture. After him, we get to Chandragupta II, also known as Vikramaditya. He ruled from 375 to 415 CE. This is often seen as the real peak of the empire, right?
Very much so. Gupta records actually say Samudragupta himself chose Chandragupta II, his son with Queen Datta Devi, to succeed him. He took that title, Vikramaditya, brave as the sun.
And he used marriage alliances strategically, too.
He did. He married Kubernaga, a Naga princess, and another princess from the Kadamba dynasty in Karnataka. And very importantly, his daughter, Prabhavatagupta, married the Vakataka king in the Deccan. That created a really significant political link to the south.
And militarily, did keep expanding, especially westward.
Yes, westward expansion was key during his reign. He finally defeated the Saka Western Kshatrabas who controlled Malwa, Gujarat, Saurashtra. That campaign took years, wrapping up around 409 CE. Their last big ruler, Rudrasimha III, was beaten by 395.
So he secured the western coast.
He did. He also dealt with chiefdoms in Bengal. So effectively, Gupta influence stretched from coast to coast. This also led him to set up a second capital at Ujjain, which was strategically important.
Were there other conquests?
There are some inscriptions from Kuntala suggesting his influence reached into Karnataka, and there's a debated inscription found way up in Hunza that hints at conquest north of the subcontinent, but its authenticity is really questioned by most scholars.
Okay. But this era, Chandragupta II's reign, it's particularly famous for culture and arts, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Even though it involved military campaigns, his time is renowned for just incredibly influential Hindu art, literature, culture, science. We see amazing Hindu art like the panels at the Dashavatara temple in Diogar. They really show that distinctive Gupta style.
What made the art so distinctive?
It was partly this synthesis, this blending of different artistic traditions that gave Gupta art its unique character. And importantly, they weren't just focused on Hindu art. The Guptas supported Buddhist and Jain cultures too. So you have this rich legacy of non-Hindu art from the period as well. Gupta Buddhist art in particular had a huge impact later in East and Southeast Asia.
And his court was famous for its intellectuals, the Nine Jewels.
Indeed. The Navaratna, the Nine Jewels, a legendary group of 9 brilliant scholars and artists. The most famous probably was Kalidasa.
The great Sanskrit poet and playwright.
Exactly. Considered one of the greatest, famous for his mastery of Sringara, the sort of romantic mood in his works like Abhidhamma Shakuntalam.
Didn't Kalidasa also write about Chandragupta II's military victories?
He did, yes. In his epic poems, Kalidasa credits Vikramaditya Chandragupta II with conquering something like 21 kingdoms, both inside and outside India.
21.
He describes campaigns east and west, then turning north to subdue groups like the Parasikas, the Hunas, Kambojas in the Oxus Valley region, then even up into the Himalayas. Kalidasa specifically credits him with kicking the Sakas out of Ujjain too.
And there are other accounts.
Yes, a later Kashmiri writer, Shimendra, tells a similar story in his Brihat Kathamanjari about King Vikramaditya clearing the earth of barbarians, Sakas, Hunas, Kambojas, and others.
Yeah, we have an outsider's perspective, too, from this time, a visitor from China.
We do, and it's incredibly valuable. Faxian, the Chinese Buddhist monk, he traveled through India between 405 and 411 CE, right during Chandragupta II's reign. His writings are a crucial historical source.
What did he observe?
He traveled widely, Mathura, Kanauj, Pataliputra, visiting Buddhist sites, and he was really impressed by how much the administration seemed. He noted the penal code was quite lenient, fines were the usual punishment.
Not harsh physical punishments.
Apparently not typically. He also mentioned the freedom people had to move around, the royal land tax system, and that the king had salaried bodyguards. And he observed, especially in the Mathura region, that people generally avoided killing animals, drinking alcohol, even eating onions and garlic.
It sounds quite idyllic, almost. A prosperous, relatively peaceful society. But, like all empires, the peak doesn't last forever. Decline eventually set in. What happened after Chandragupta II?
His son, Kumar Gupta III, took over. He ruled until 455 CE, used the title Mahendraditya. Towards the end of his reign, though, problems started brewing. There was a group called the Pushyamitras in the Narmada Valley gaining power, becoming a threat.
Internal threats, then.
Yes, and likely external ones, too. Probably conflicts with the Kidarites on the northwestern frontier. On a more positive note, Kumar Gupta I is credited with founding Nalanda University.
Oh, the famous Nalanda.
The very one, which became such a major center of learning later on. He was also a devotee of the god Kartikeya.
And his successor, Skandagupta. He faced even tougher challenges.
He certainly did. Skandagupta ruled from 455 to 467 CE. He used titles like Vikramaditya and Gramaditya. He's generally seen as the last of the really great Gupta emperors.
Why is that?
Well, he successfully dealt with that Pushyamitra threat, but then he faced major invasions from the northwest from the Kidarites, who are sometimes identified as the White Huns or Hunas.
The Huna invasions.
Exactly. He managed to repel a big Huna attack around 455 CE, but the cost of these wars was immense. It really strained the empire's finances, contributing significantly to its decline later on.
Is that documented?
Yes. Skandagupta's own Batari pillar inscription talks about the empire being brought to the brink, nearly annihilated by these attacks. And it seems the Kidarites managed to hold on to the western parts of the empire even after being pushed back initially.
So those invasions really marked a turning point.
A critical one, yes. After Skandagupta died around 467, the empire visibly weakened. Later, Gupta coins show they lost control over much of western India. Then you have a series of subsequent rulers, Puragupta, Kumaragupta II, Buddhagupta, and so on, but the trajectory was generally downwards.
And the Hunas came back.
They did. In the late 490s, you have the Alkan Huns, led by figures like Toramana and his son Mirakala. They broke through the defenses in the northwest again. By 500 CE, they controlled a lot of that region.
Was there still resistance?
Yes, the diminished Gupta forces kept fighting. Banagupta reportedly defeated Toramana in 510, and later, around 528, Yashodharman, a ruler from Malwa, possibly with some Gupta help, managed to drive the Huns out again. but the damage was done.
And these invasions, they had consequences beyond just the political map changing, didn't they? Long-term effects.
Oh, profound long-term effects. Some historians argue these invasions really marked the end of what we think of as classical Indian civilization. Trade routes were shattered.
Especially the ones going west.
Yes, the lucrative trade with Europe and Central Asia, which the Guptas had benefited from, was severely disrupted. Urban centers declined. Buddhism took a massive hit.
Why Buddhism specifically?
Mihirakula, in particular, is known for persecuting Buddhists and destroying monasteries. Major learning centers like Taxila were destroyed. It led to a period of, well, cultural step back in some areas.
That's significant.
And some even suggest these invasions might have shaken up the social structure, the hierarchy of ruling families, even the caste system. There's a theory that the Hunas might be precursors to groups like the Rajputs who emerged later.
So a whole cascade of negative consequences. What finally brought the empire itself to an end?
Well, after the Huns retreated, northern India just fractured politically. Lots of smaller, independent powers popped up. The Gupta Empire itself lingered on, but in a much smaller form.
For how long?
The last known Gupta inscription is from Vishnugupta's reign, dated 542 or 543 CE. It records a land grant after Yashodharman's occupation, so they were still around but weakened. The main Gupta line is generally thought to have ended around 600 CE.
Any other factors in the final decline?
Interestingly, a fairly recent archaeological study from 2019 suggested a massive, devastating flood in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar around the mid-6th century might have been a contributing factor. Nature playing a part too, perhaps?
And what came after in those regions?
In the Gangetic region, you see successor dynasties like the Mokharis and the Pushyabudis, and they actually adopted Gupta-style coinage for a while. Out west, different groups emerged, like the Gurjara Pratiharas, using coinage influenced more by the Sasanian Empire and Persia.
Fascinating to see those echoes. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. We touched on the military earlier. How did the Gupta army differ from, say, the earlier Maurya Empire's army?
There were some key differences. The Guptas seem to have made much more use of things like siege engines, and heavy cavalry was really important.
Cavalry archer.
Yes, heavy cavalry archers and also heavy sword cavalry. Heavy cavalry seems to have become the core of their army, supported by the traditional elephants and infantry.
And we see this reflected elsewhere.
We do. Look at the coins of Chandragupta II, Kumaragupta VI, Prakasaditya, who might be Pru-Gupta. They often show the king as a skilled horse archer. It strongly suggests this was a key part of their military identity and strategy.
Do we know much about their actual battlefield tactics?
Unfortunately, detailed accounts are pretty scarce. Our best literary clue probably comes from Kalidasa's epic poem, the Raghuvasha.
Which might reflect Chandragupta II's campaigns.
Many scholars think so. And in it, Kalidasa describes battles against powerful cavalry forces like the Persians and the Yavanas, probably the Huns out in the northwest. And he specifically mentions the king's army using horse archers in those fights.
So a blend of arms.
Right. The traditional list includes 5 arms: infantry, cavalry, chariots, elephants, and ships. Though one copper plate inscription, the Gunagar plate of Vanyagupta, mentions ships but notably doesn't mention chariots, suggesting their importance might have waned somewhat.
Interesting. Okay, moving on to religion and how the empire was run, its administration.
So, the Guptas themselves were traditionally a Hindu dynasty. They were big patrons of Brahmanism, but crucially, they allowed Buddhism and Jainism to be practiced freely.
Tolerance was a feature then.
Generally, yes. Sanchi remained a major Buddhist center, and as we mentioned, Kumaragupta, I founded Nalanda. Interestingly, some modern genetic studies suggest this period saw a strengthening of endogamy, the practice of marrying within your own caste group.
Were there exceptions to the Hindu patronage among the rulers?
There seem to have been. Some later rulers, like Narasimhagupta Baladitya, appeared to lean towards Buddhism, maybe influenced by the philosopher Vasubandhu. He's credited with building monasteries at Nalanda and, according to some traditions, might have even become a monk himself later in life. His son, Vajra, also seems to have had strong Buddhist faith.
In the administrative structure, how was the empire organized?
It was hierarchical. You had provinces called Bhukti, Desha, or Raja. These were divided into districts, Vishayas or Pradeshas. Each district was run by a Vishayapati.
The district administrator.
Right. And they were helped by a council, the Adhikarana, which had representatives from different groups, town guilds, rural bodies, etc. Below the district, you had smaller units called Vithi.
And economically.
They maintained important trade links with the Sasanian Empire in Persia, with the Byzantine Empire further west. Society generally followed the Varna system, the caste structure, but it wasn't totally rigid in terms of occupation. You find examples of Brahmins doing jobs not traditionally associated with them, or Kshatriyas involved in trade.
And cities thrived under the Guptas?
Yes, urban centers definitely grew. The main capital seems to have initially been Prayag. Then later, in the 5th century, it shifted to Ayodhya. Chandragupta II, as we said, took a special interest in Ujjain after conquering it, and some think Karshi, Varanasi, might have served as a capital at times too. Faxian certainly described the region of Magadha as prosperous, with large towns and populations.
It paints a picture of a complex, well-administered state, facilitating culture and trade. So let's bring it together. The legacy of the Gupta Empire. It's often called a golden age. And listening to all this, you can see why.
Absolutely. The impact was just immense across so many different fields. Mathematics, for instance. This is where we see the origin of Indian numerals, the base 10 positional system we use today.
That's foundational.
Hugely. Plus the sign table in the Surya Satanta, Aryabhata's incredible work on place value, approximating pi, trigonometry, squared triangular numbers,
Aryabhata is a huge name.
and Varahamihira's formulas, Yativa Abha's work on measurement units, Virhanka describing Fibonacci numbers. It was a boom time for math.
And astronomy, too.
Yes, big advances there. Naming weekdays after Hindu deities and planets that starts here. Aryabhata figuring out the Earth rotates, that the day starts at midnight, that the moon reflects sunlight, not producing its own. He even calculated the Earth's circumference pretty accurately.
Amazing insights for the time.
And Varahamihira had methods for determining the meridian. In medicine, the famous Sushruta Samhita text on surgery saw significant additions and redactions during this period.
What about technology or engineering?
Metallurgy stands out. The iron pillar of Delhi, famous for resisting rust for centuries. That incredibly thin protective layer of crystalline iron hydrogen phosphate hydrate. That's Gupta-era technology.
Still spanning today.
Exactly. And we see the earliest evidence for a single-roller cotton gin in paintings at Ajanta from the 5th century.
Education.
Flourished. You had various Mahaviharas, these large monastic universities, with Nalanda becoming especially important.
And literature.
Often considered the absolute high point for Sanskrit literature. We mentioned Harisena, Samudragupta's courtier, known for his kavya poetry, Amar Simha, the lexicographer, Kalidasa, of course, Hartahari, the grammarian and poet. Just stellar names.
Even leisure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Chess, or its early form, chaturanga, developed during this time. Medical instruments were invented, surgical operations refined, and Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra also dates from this general period.
And finally, art and architecture.
Considered a classic peak for North Indian art, serving all the major religions, Hindu, Buddhist, Jain. This is when you really see the emergence of iconic sculptures of deities. Mathura and Gandhara were key centers. Famous Gupta-style monuments include the Udayagiri Caves, the Dashavatara Temple at Deogar.
Even influencing later sites.
Yes, places like the Ajanta, Elephanta, and Ellora caves, although built or expanded by later dynasties, show strong Gupta influence in their style and aesthetics. Think of the reclining Vishnu at Deogar, the Sarnath Buddha image, the Trimurti at Elephanta, the Ajanta murals. Just iconic works, even architectural features like the pointed arches at the Bitargaon temple.
It's just an incredible range of achievements, a truly multifaceted legacy touching almost every aspect of Indian civilization at the time.
It really is. When you look at the political power, the military successes, the explosion in culture, science, art, it's easy to understand why it's held in such high regard.
Absolutely. It presents this rich tapestry, as you say. So, thinking about all this and considering those differing views on calling it a golden age, what single achievement or aspect of the Gupta Empire do you personally find most indicative of a high point in Indian civilization? And why do you think different historians might emphasize different aspects or even challenge that golden label? Something for you, our listeners, to perhaps reflect on after our conversation today.